This video covers China in the 19th century. This is a very unique period in Chinese history. From the beginning of our course up until the 19th century, China had been the dominant civilization on Earth. It was the most technologically advanced, culturally complex, economically prosperous society on Earth. And while there were periods where Chinese civilization ebbed and flowed, and even periods where China had been conquered by outside powers like the Mongols, there had never been a period where China was completely outmatched, where the Chinese had conceived of their own situation as being backwards relative to some other power. It was the outside world that was full of barbarians, all the peoples who surrounded China and came from different directions towards Jungmo, the Middle Kingdom, right? The center of the earth, which is how people conceived of China. So for the first time, China is not the center of the earth. The European powers have outdone China technologically, militarily, economically, and this causes an existential crisis for Chinese thought. Suddenly, this society that was at the center of the world can no longer keep up, and this causes a veritable cataclysm of confidence, right? A huge crisis of confidence. And not only do you have this crisis of confidence, you have massive amounts of destruction, both within and without China. You have foreign powers picking China apart, taking territory, bullying China in a way that it had never been bullied before. You have internal disruptions, creating millions of casualties, massive famines, and a level of upheaval that China hadn't experienced since the Three Kingdoms period. So this is a very bleak period of Chinese history. From the 1840s to the 1940s, generally in China, this period of time is referred to as the century of humiliation. This is a period where China is vulnerable, abused, taken advantage of from the standpoint of Chinese historiography. And I also want to point out that this is an era of foreign invasions, but these foreign invasions are documented by photographs. So there are going to be some relatively difficult photographs in the next few lectures, right? So I just want to point this out. Just be warned that some of the photos can be quite graphic. In fact, I'm about to show one that is relatively graphic. It is an image of a young Chinese man about to be beheaded by a Japanese soldier. During the 1930s and the first half of the 1940s, an untold number of Chinese people died in the Second World War. Historians have estimated that it may have been as upward as 40 million. The problem is that they're so numerous that it's difficult to count exactly how many people were killed. And this has left a very bitter taste in the mouths of Chinese historians. And this period while this is the culmination of the century of humiliation, the Japanese occupation, the atrocities of World War II, some of them consisting of experiments, scientific experiments that are so gruesome that they really are chilling. Mass slaughter, the liquidation of populations, and as I mentioned, scientific experiments conducted by really mad scientists that were extraordinarily cruel and inhuman. So this begins in the first half of the 19th century. And this period has left such a bad taste in the mouths of Chinese historians that it affects the contemporary political process. I'll give an example. I can't show the banner. I'm worried that this video will be taken down if I do. But there was an Audi dealership in China in the 2000s, and it was one of the most successful Audi dealerships on earth. Corporate headquarters sent a representative to China to figure out what are they doing that they're selling this many cars? Why are people in China buying up Audis right and left? Well, they had put up a banner on their dealership, and it said, even if China is covered in graves, even if China is covered in graves, all Japanese must be erased. Right? And this is an extreme statement of, of genocide, right? But this statement it caused people to go in there and buy cars. The reason for this is because there is such lasting animosity over some of these experiences. Lasting animosity towards Japan, for the most part, but also towards Britain and towards some other powers. And we're going to talk about the beginning of this period of humiliation in this video. And so just keep this in mind as we move forward in time. The Qing dynasty replaced the Ming in the 17th century. The Qing had been founded, I believe it was 1648. The Qing had been founded by the Manchus, an ethnic group living in Manchuria, in what's now the far northeast of the People's Republic of China. The Manchu, like the Mongols or the Xiongnu, they were not Han Chinese. They were not ethnically Chinese. Chinese was not their main language. They spoke Manchu. And they established a dynasty where the Manchu were the privileged rulers. They created something called the banner system, similar to the kind of system set up by the Mongols, where the Manchu were on top and the Chinese were beneath them. In fact, they created a law that demanded that every Chinese man, every ethnic Chinese man, grow his hair in what's called a queue, a single long braided ponytail that went down his back, and the rest of his head would be shaved. I'm going to pull up a picture of one in a moment. But this haircut was there to distinguish between the Han Chinese, who had to wear this hairstyle, and the Manchu, who could wear their hair in traditional styles. So the Manchu differentiated between themselves and the Chinese. However, when it came to their rulership, they ruled in a very traditional Chinese way. The Qing dynasty emperors adopted state Confucianism. State Confucianism flourished under their rule. They restored the examination system that had become corrupted at the end of the Ming dynasty. So you had an administration governed by bureaucrats chosen by their knowledge of the Confucian classics through the administration of these exams that we've talked about before. So you have this highly complex bureaucratic state that is very much a Chinese state, despite the fact that those administering at the very top are non-Chinese. The Qing dynasty would take China to its greatest territorial extent. They conquered Mongolia. They conquered Tibet. Right? So they dominated Central Asia. And the Qing dynasty would also take China to its greatest extent of population growth up to this period of time. In the 17th and 18th centuries, emperors like Kangxi ruled with magnanimity and virtue. So you have these excellent rulers who are producing prosperity for the population. The population is growing, the economy is growing, and China is experiencing a boom. Even though this is the period of time where Europeans are discovering the Americas, the Spanish and Portuguese are establishing their massive empires and obtaining great amounts of gold and silver, China is still maintaining its edge. The reason for this is that even though the Spanish were uncovering massive amounts of gold and silver in the New World, I say uncovering, more like looting massive amounts of gold and silver in the New World, this gold and silver was ending up in Chinese coffers. The reason for this is the massive imbalance of trade. And I'll talk more about the imbalance of trade in a moment. But the European powers were eager to purchase Chinese goods. Right? They wanted tea, they wanted porcelain, right? And to obtain this, they wanted silk. They would trade for these goods with precious metals, silver and gold coins that had an innate value. So China during the 17th and 18th centuries was becoming the world's a repository of silver and gold, and massive amounts of currency was flowing into China, and it was making Chinese society and the Chinese people wealthier and wealthier. The economy was growing, life was improving, and the population was growing as a result. But by the early 19th century, the Industrial Revolution was in full swing in Great Britain and the United States. Well, by the mid 19th century, it was in full swing. In the early 19th century, it was developing. Uh, and China would find itself in decline relative to the rest of the world. You start to have a lack of economic growth. And keep in mind, there's a massive population. So you have tremendous economic strain. You have a tremendous strain regarding the food supply. On top of this, the Qing administration had, like every dynasty before it, become corrupted. You had very powerful eunuchs calling the shots, dictating to weak emperors. You had emperors who remained in the palace and didn't attend to the needs of the people. And as a result, you had one of the largest rebellions in the history of the world, as well as the spread of epidemic disease, and ultimately weakness in the face of foreign invasion. So during the early part of the 19th century, the Qing dynasty began to unravel. It didn't completely fall apart, but it became severely weakened and rife for exploitation. I've got here an image of the queue, the haircut imposed on the ethnic Chinese by the Manchu who ruled the Qing dynasty. It's also called bianzi. That's the system of enforcing this haircut on the Chinese people. And this was a sign of their submission. In fact, when the revolution occurs in the 20th century, men will ceremoniously chop off that single braid as a sign that they're no longer under Manchu domination. And it becomes so culturally ingrained that when you have immigrants immigrating to the United States in the later 19th century, these first generation immigrants will maintain this hairstyle their entire lives, even though they no longer legally have to. It's part of their identity by that point. As mentioned earlier, there was a humongous trade imbalance. And this is the case throughout virtually the entirety of written history. China historically was the workshop of the world, then as now. And the rest of the world along the Silk Road imported Chinese goods, and their precious metals would end up in Chinese hands as a result. So throughout the centuries, China became wealthier, while the rest of the world became, relatively speaking, poorer, due to the fact that gold and silver was leaving those societies in the Middle East, in North Africa, in Europe, and moving into Chinese hands. And keep in mind, when we talked about the Ming Dynasty, the voyage of Zheng He. Zheng He traveled all the way to East Africa. He sailed across the Indian Ocean, 80 years before Vasco da Gama sailed around the Cape of Good Hope, and the Portuguese began to make inroads in transoceanic navigation. But the Chinese were not interested in these voyages in the long run, due to the fact that they didn't find goods that they wanted produced in other societies. China was self-sufficient economically. There was not so much an interest in the outside world due to the fact that, from the Chinese point of view, the outside world was simply lacking. And this is what caused China to look inward during a very crucial period of worldwide technological change. And this would ultimately come back to damage China. But Great Britain had become the world's dominant empire in the early 19th century. They were establishing themselves in India, in huge parts of Africa, North America. Eventually they would take over Australia and New Zealand. And the British, despite their great power and their industrialization, they still enjoyed still suffered from a massive trade imbalance with China. And the British government wanted to redress this situation. They wanted to end this huge trade deficit. They weren't going to give up importing the tea, the silk, the porcelain from China, but they didn't have anything to sell the Chinese in return. Well, they began to search for some kind of commodity that the Chinese would consume that would help to redress this imbalance of trade. And this will lead to one of the most egregious conflicts in the history of the world. The British were currently colonizing what's now India and Pakistan. And part of this experience was coming into contact with poppies, with the plant, the poppy, that could be smoked as opium, right? A very, very strong narcotic, right? A literal opiate, right? The kind of grandfather of all opiates, which is a class of drug that involves heroin, right? Fentanyl is a synthetic opiate, right? An opioid. So all of these extreme painkiller drugs owe their origin to opium, right? Morphine, heroin, fentanyl, right? Opium is the grandfather of them all. So the British began to notice that this product could be exported with great demand. After all, it's a highly addictive drug, and these British merchants understood that it was addictive. And so it's being produced in India, which is under British authority. Some British merchants get the idea that, hey, when we go to China to purchase tea, silk, porcelain, we can sell opium in China and we will make back our profits. Right? This will fix the imbalance of trade. So you have British merchants bring opium into China in large amounts by the 1830s. And opium smoking caught on in a population that was completely unprepared for what that meant. The Chinese, like virtually every other population on Earth at the time that had farming, had experience with alcoholism. Centuries of traditional Chinese medicine had produced remedies that were very effective in treating alcoholism. The main substance that's used to fight alcoholism in traditional Chinese medicine is kudzu, if you've ever heard of that. I'm from Mississippi, and kudzu's everywhere in Mississippi. That plant is very useful in preventing alcoholics from drinking, right? And also from mitigating the effects of alcohol withdrawal. So in traditional Chinese medicine, for people who are hooked on alcohol, kudzu is the solution. But it takes years of alcoholism to get to the point to where you have actual biological withdrawals, at least for most people. Right? It takes years of daily drinking to get to the point to where if you stop, you can go into physical withdrawal. And of course, with alcohol withdrawal, that withdrawal, it's one of the most dangerous withdrawals of any drug. It can actually kill a person if they're severely addicted and they stop. But experience with an addictive substance like opium had never been experienced before. And keep in mind, alcohol does have its own kind of natural inhibitor in that you get sick from over consuming it. This isn't the case with opium. So people become addicted to opium. In Chinese society, which is traditionally, as I stated at the very beginning of the course, it's collectivist. One of the greatest virtues is filial piety, right? Reverence for one's elders, adherence to a very rigid system of family hierarchy, a family values-based culture. Suddenly you had situations where people were abandoning their children, abandoning their parents. They were experiencing, they were going into opium dens and staying there for days. So in this culture where these kinds of behaviors were largely unknown, suddenly they began to spring up. You start to have crime, right? And in most of Chinese history, then as now, China is extraordinarily safe, right? A very, very strict system of punishments helped to maintain law and order. And suddenly there was lawlessness, there was crime, there was a massive amount of domestic violence, and the government tried to figure out what was going on. The government sent a police commissioner, Lin Zexu. Lin Zexu is the first police officer in the history of the world to be tasked with a concerted anti-drug interdiction mission. He is the first drug czar in world history. And when he investigated the opium dens in Canton, in Guangzhou, in southern China, the southern Chinese port cities were where the British were mainly doing business, and that's where the opium was being brought into the country. He noticed that the conditions were deplorable. As I stated before, people abandoning their families, people dying in the streets, literally violence and crime on a level that had previously been unknown. And he had enough. He seized the opium that had been brought in to Canton by British merchants. He boarded their ships, seized these drugs, and cast them into the harbor. And so he had several tons of opium thrown into the harbor, which outraged these British merchants. He seized their property from their point of view illegally, because they didn't understand how Chinese law worked. And while it wasn't illegal to bring opium in at that point, the emperor is the one who determines the law, and as the representative of the emperor, Lin Zhishu could make the law. And on top of this, he outraged them further by telling them that if they came back to China with opium, they would be put to death. In 1839, Lin Zhishu wrote a letter to Queen Victoria, the Queen of England and of the British Empire, urging her to stop British merchants from bringing opium into China. He noted how destructive the drug was, how it destroyed families, how it was inhumane to trade in this substance. And then he said, frankly, and you see the image here, the relief of the Qing officers, police officers throwing the opium into the harbor. He said that if they bring opium back into our country, we're going to put them to death. And it doesn't matter who they are. It doesn't matter how you attempt to intervene. They will be put to death. And then he pointed out, suppose that we were coming to your country and we were selling something that destroyed your families, that destroyed the lives of your people. You would be bitterly opposed to it. And it was a very rational, very logically structured letter. Unfortunately, it didn't have the desired effect. The British government was already upset over this huge trade imbalance with China, the traditional trade imbalance, and their inability to change this trade imbalance. So they ended up declaring war, using the seizure of the opium as an excuse that the Qing officials, Lin Zhishu, had illegally seized British property, and they used that as a pretext for war. The Qing government prepares its navy to fight against Great Britain. The problem is that the Qing are completely outmatched at sea. This is a period of time where the British Navy is supreme on the planet. The British have the most dominant navy in the world with the most advanced ships, some of them armored with metal, and they're not full ironclads. We won't get those until the American Civil War, but they were able to make mincemeat out of the Qing Navy. Not only that, the British are able to land a force of Marines in Canton who have the most up-to-date weapons, and the Chinese can't dislodge them, despite the fact that the Qing military is so much larger. These technologically advanced Western troops, though completely outnumbered, have reversed the traditional Chinese paradigm. They have, through their better training and better equipment, defeated the Chinese military. So the Qing government has to sue for peace. And this is one of the most humiliating events in Chinese history. So not only did the Chinese government have to sue for peace after being defeated by Great Britain, they had to sue for peace over a war that the British started because the British wanted to bring opium into China. They essentially had to allow the British to continue to import drugs into their country that was killing their people. It's one of the most shameful, vicious defeats that any nation has endured in history. After the British win the war, they forced the Qing government to sign the Treaty of Nanjing in 1842, one of the most humiliating peace treaties in the history of the world. The treaty cedes Hong Kong to Great Britain. If you've ever wondered why Hong Kong is kind of a semi-separate entity from mainland China, it goes back to this event. Hong Kong was ceded as a colony to Great Britain, so the British will control Hong Kong directly ruling it until 1997. Hong Kong will be the base of operations for the British Empire in East Asia. The Chinese were forced to open their treaties to British trade, and not only that, they had to pay for the cost of the war, including the cost of the heroin, the opium that Lin Zexu had dumped into the water. This was an absolute slap in the face. It was basically the British government spitting on the Qing dynasty. And people inside China were outraged that the government was so weak that this atrocity could be allowed to happen. And it produced a great amount of bitterness. The worst aspect of all was the issue of extraterritoriality. And what this meant is that when British merchants or British subjects in general misbehaved in China, committing a crime, they wouldn't be tried by Chinese courts. They would be tried by British Admiralty courts. So, for example, if you're caught selling opium, you're tried in a British court where you might pay a tiny fine versus the Chinese court where you would be put to death, right? And so this is the beginning of something that in East Asia is a cause of great resentment. I'll give the example. In the 1990s, there was an American teenager who went around vandalizing cars in the city-state of Singapore, which has an ethnic Chinese majority. In Singapore, when you commit certain crimes like vandalism, the punishment is caning, actually being hit with a rod right on the butt in a corporal punishment. It's very, very painful. Well, this American teenager didn't want to have to go through the caning because he argued that it was cruel and unusual punishment, and he asked for the United States to get him out of this punishment, and the Singapore government said, no, you committed this crime in our country. We no longer honor extraterritoriality. Just because you're a Westerner doesn't mean that you get out of facing the penalty of our courts. This is our land. This is our sovereignty. We're going to cane you. And he was caned. Part of the problem was that this was in the 1990s when there was a large anti-crime sentiment among the American public. So many people in the United States actually sympathized with the Singaporean government for the policy of caning, right? But this issue of extraterritoriality was a huge part of that whole debacle. And when about a decade or so ago, when several Australian citizens were caught trafficking drugs into Indonesia, and they were executed. The Australian government doesn't have the death penalty, and the Australian government was bitterly opposed to these men being executed. But the Indonesian government said, we're no longer honoring extraterritoriality. Just because they're Australian citizens doesn't mean that they don't have to follow Indonesian law. Right? And they were killed by firing squad. There are lasting repercussions of this treaty, and this was very, very humiliating for Chinese culture, which had previously been supreme in its world. Right? So we're already in a period of massive instability due to out-of-control population growth, poverty, growing poverty, economic unraveling, right? And suddenly, the Qing government is humiliated in this horrific war that ends very badly, and the Qing cannot protect the Chinese people. This helps foment something called the Daiping Rebellion. This is one of the most destructive rebellions in the history of mankind. It's up there with the Anlu Shan Rebellion, and it's actually a little bit worse in terms of the number of people killed. In fact, we're looking at, on a generous estimate, up to possibly 70 million people losing their lives during the war surrounding this rebellion, making this the second most destructive war in the history of the world. In fact, about 2% of the human population perished in the conflict over this rebellion. So we're looking at an event on a monumental scale, and within the Chinese context, absolutely cataclysmic. So this would change China forever. We've looked at the causes, the background, the poverty, the overpopulation, the defeat in the Opium War, and the loss of legitimacy for the Qing government. Now let's take a look at the man behind the rebellion. At the heart of the rebellion was a cult led by a charismatic cult leader named Hung Shu-chuan. Hung Shu-chuan claimed to be the little brother of Jesus Christ. And again, you can see the Western influence kind of entering consciousness. He claimed to be the little brother of Jesus Christ, and he blended some aspects of Christianity, loving your neighbor, right? The golden rule, for example, blended those with his own ideas, and mostly ideas taken from Taoism. So he claimed to be the little brother of Jesus Christ, and he believed that he would lead the people into a utopia. And so if the peasants come and follow him, he will be able to not only lead them into a better life, but he has supernatural powers. He can cure diseases. He can levitate. He can do other supernatural things. And it's very similar to the Yellow Turban Rebellion in the first century, or the second century, in the Han Dynasty, rather, right? So in the 100s, late 100s AD. So Hung Shu-chuan gathered an army of followers and launched his rebellion in southern China in the early 1850s. And this rebellion spread like wildfire. Millions of starving, disaffected peasants joined his banner and took up arms against the Qing government. One of Hung Shu-chuan's main goals was to restore the well-field system. In other words, to redistribute land among the poor. He wanted to take the wealthy elites, the Manchus, who controlled large estates, take their land, give it to kind of the teeming, starving masses who had become too numerous to feed in the later 18th century, early 19th century. The idea was to break up these huge estates, to end this kind of extreme wealth inequality, and therefore achieve economic stability. On top of this, he believed in extreme gender equality. So he believed that men and women should be treated in a similar fashion in virtually every aspect of life, which is why you have in his army, you had female soldiers. And he believed in a very, very strict moral code, kind of a fusion of some of the more austere Christian movements like Quakers and Shakers with traditional Confucian morality. And so this force was very numerous. He was very popular, and he took entire provinces under his control. He ends up passing away without his rebellion being utterly crushed. After his death, his movement is completely crushed by the Qing government, but not before the Qing government was really mortally weakened. The conservative estimate, 20 to 30 million. Again, a more generous estimate, up to 70 million people being killed during this war, making it the second deadliest war in history. And this is not the kind of conflict that a society easily recovers from. And so, particularly in southern China, which was a much more prosperous region of China before the conflict. So this is the equivalent of a huge war breaking out in the northeastern United States and lasting for 14 years, and 30 million Americans being killed. Right? This is an absolute disaster for the Qing government. Even though they managed to crush the rebellion, it ruins their legitimacy even further. It wrecks the economy, and it leads to massive human misery. The most humiliating aspect of this rebellion was the fact that the Qing government only crushed the rebellion with the help of foreign powers, in particular Great Britain, right? The very enemy that had damaged the Qing, that had imported drugs into Qing society, that had destabilized the country and helped to foment the rebellion indirectly was needed to help crush the rebellion. The British and French determined that ultimately a more stable China was necessary for trade, so they supported the government and they ended up funding the government in crushing the rebellion. Another country that participated in helping the Qing government crush the rebellion was the United States. A man named Frederick Townsend Ward had helped to train many of the Qing troops in modern tactics, and they were very successful in part due to his effort. But the American help was looked at very differently from the British help. Right? The Qing were much more enthusiastic to receive help from the United States than from Great Britain, a country that had very recently been a mortal foe. But this was a huge blow. How could the Qing government be so bad off that they not only can't protect us from the rebels, but they have to have these barbarians come and help them win victory? How did things get this bad? Right? This is an aspect of the psychological trauma that I was talking about earlier. It was clear that the Qing government was not up to the task of maintaining stability and protecting China. There were those who wanted to reform the government, to modernize Chinese society, to industrialize, to create a more efficient state. And the urge to do this becomes particularly pronounced in the late 1860s after the Japanese are extraordinarily successful in modernizing their country. The Japanese, within one generation, were able to transform Japan from a feudal state into an industrial power with its own imperial colonies, right? And we'll talk about that in the next week's video. But so there is this urge to modernize China. Unfortunately, for those who wanted to modernize China, one person was in their way. That was the Empress Dowager Cixi. Cixi was the Empress Dowager, the mother of the young emperor. She ruled as regent, and she held power up until the end of the monarchy in the early 20th century. Right? So we're looking at an over 40-year period where she's pulling the strings, effectively running the country. If you watch the film The Last Emperor, when Henry Puyi, the last emperor of China, enters the throne room as a little boy, and there's the older woman who's on the throne dying. That's Cixi, right? She is the one who chooses him to be emperor, the very last emperor of the Qing dynasty. And Cixi is against modernization. And this is part of the problem, is she's very adept politically, and she can maintain support from different factions at court, but she opposes the kinds of reforms that would fundamentally change the government and transform Chinese society into a society that could defend itself. So thanks to Cixi, there's a great amount of stagnation in the Chinese court and in the Chinese economy and military. You have scholar official after scholar official seeking to modernize the Chinese army, seeking to modernize its economy, to introduce factories, to reform the political system. And all of these efforts are effectively blocked by Cixi, who even has some of these scholars jailed and executed. So she's holding up the reforms that are necessary to save China. To make matters even worse, in the 1890s, the newly modernized Japan, with a fully modern, powerful army and navy, goes to war with China over control of Korea and absolutely wrecks the Qing dynasty. So we have yet another humiliating military defeat. This one far more severe than what the British had dealt China in the first part of the 19th century, the first half of the 19th century. This would effectively deny China its most powerful vassal state, the Hermit Kingdom of Korea, and bring Korea under Japanese dominion, as well as Formosa, the island of Taiwan. Just as the Opium War had led to the Taiping Rebellion, This defeat at the hands of Japan would lead to a new rebellion, the Boxer Rebellion of 1899. We call it the Boxer Rebellion because that was the Western derogatory term for the rebels, right, who followed something called the Society of the Harmonious and Righteous Fist, which was a secret society of rebels who wanted to drive out all foreign influence, drive out Christianity, and to restore China to its traditions without, and not only that, to block any attempts at any kind of reform of the government or economy. And Cixi supported the Boxer rebels, secretly funding them, secretly giving them the go-ahead to launch an uprising. Cixi supported the Boxers, gave them the full authority of the imperial government, and declared war on the foreign powers occupying ports in China. You can see them in this cartoon here. Queen Victoria, there's the German Kaiser, there's the Tsar of Russia, there's La Marie of France, and there is a Japanese official, right, a samurai. Right? These are the foreign powers picking apart China. There was a massive response by the international community after a number of Western merchants and soldiers were attacked and killed. You have a coalition of foreign countries, the British, the French, the Germans, the Japanese, and the United States, who all sent troops to suppress this rebellion. And they were very successful. The Boxers had believed that due to certain esoteric practices, they could be immune from the soldiers' bullets. They found out that this was not the case. The rebellion was utterly crushed, and Cixi was humiliated as a result. When the trances and spells and talismans and different martial arts practices failed to protect the Boxers, the members of the Society of the Righteous and Harmonious Fist, this kind of secretive martial arts organization of rebels, when they were not protected from Western bullets and were utterly crushed, China was forced to sign something called the Boxer Protocol, in which Cixi agreed to pay massive indemnities to Western powers, and not only that, to cede part of the role of securing the capital to Western powers as well. So you have British, French, Russian troops in Beijing, right, which is then called Peking, which was an absolute atrocity to many Chinese people, a huge humiliation. In 1908, the last Qing emperor, Puyi, took the throne at 2 years of age. He would only remain on the throne for 4 years, being forced to abdicate in 1912 during the Xinhai Revolution, launched by the revolutionary leader Sun Yat-sen, who wanted to modernize China and create a republic. With the abdication of Puyi, 2,000 years of imperial Chinese rule and the Qing dynasty would both come to an end. Puyi would live in the Forbidden City until 1924, after which he would live a very interesting, if very tragic, life. He would serve as a puppet of the Japanese Empire in his ancestral homeland of Manchuria, where he would rule as a pseudo-independent emperor in the Empire of Manchukuo. He was actually a Japanese puppet, part of the Japanese Empire. After the Second World War, he would be captured by communist forces and sent to a re-education center. He would then be retrained as a gardener, a position he would hold until his death in 1967 at the age of 61. His life is chronicled in the film The Last Emperor, one of the best films ever made about Chinese history. I strongly encourage you to watch it. It's very interesting. It's an epic film, very tragic at the same time.